What would you do if your curiosity uncovered something too terrifying to believe? Some secrets once learned can never be forgotten. This is the story of Byron House, a place where dark secrets and haunted souls dwell. Byron House wasn't just a building. It was a ghostly relic looming at the edge of Barton, casting shadows far darker than any mere bricks and mortar could muster. It had a reputation that clung to it like the thick vines twisting up its crumbling walls, a reputation steeped in whispered rumors and half-forgotten tales. For as long as anyone in town could remember, it had been a place of eerie legends, a house whose very walls seemed to pulse with a hidden, malignant life of their own. When people spoke of Byron House, it was with a hushed reverence, as though acknowledging its existence might somehow summon the horrors said to lurk within. My curiosity about Byron House didn't begin overnight. It had grown quietly, much like those tangled vines that crept along its facade. Ever since I was a child, I'd felt its silent call, heard its silent whispers in the dead of night. I used to watch from afar, hidden behind the trees that bordered the property, daring myself to inch closer, and yet never able to break through that invisible barrier of fear. It seemed to taunt me, testing my courage as though daring me to uncover the truths concealed within its walls. But the real spark came later when I began studying psychology in university. My interest in the human mind, especially its darker, untamed recesses, only seemed to intensify my curiosity about Byron House. Here was a place where the twisted recesses of the human psyche were laid bare, where the line between reality and nightmare was razor thin. As I delved into the pages of psychology textbooks, learning about conditions that could warp the mind and shatter the soul, I found myself inevitably drawn back to Byron House. The residents, or rather the inmates as some locals called them, were not just patients. They were mysteries, locked away and hidden from prying eyes, people who seemed to have vanished into a dark corner of the world that few dared to confront. Rumor had it that some of them were not like any other patients. Some, it was said, were afflicted by conditions so bizarre, so deeply disturbing, that they defied medical explanation. These whispers only fueled my obsession. What struck me most, though, was the existence of a single, shrouded figure in the legends of Byron House, an inmate no one had seen, but everyone seemed to fear. Known only as 13, this elusive resident was said to be confined to a hidden attic room, separate from the others. Tales of 13 varied wildly, some saying he was a violent madman, others whispering he was a victim of some unspeakable curse. The most fantastical of these stories claimed that 13 was not human at all, but something far older, something beyond our understanding. My logical mind dismissed these tales as fanciful exaggerations, yet deep down, I felt a flicker of doubt. Could there really be something lurking in that attic, hidden from the light? Something that had driven even seasoned caretakers to leave in horror? The whispers about Byron House, combined with my own thirst for knowledge, created a perfect storm of curiosity. It felt almost as if the house itself was calling to me, reaching out through the fog of rumors and tales to pull me closer. It was as if Byron House knew my weaknesses, knew that I couldn't resist the lure of a mystery. I was captivated by the idea that in a world filled with cold, rational explanations, there might still be pockets of unknowable darkness, realms where human understanding dared not tread. And so, when the opportunity came to work there as an orderly, I didn't hesitate. I convinced myself it was for the experience, for the chance to see firsthand the effects of psychological disorders that textbooks could only describe. But I knew, deep down, that it was more than that. I wanted answers. Byron House sat at the end of a long, twisting road that wound its way through dense forests and past marshlands, where fog hung thick in the early morning hours. The path itself seemed deliberately obscured, as though leading visitors astray before they even arrived. And once there, the house loomed out of the mist like a phantom, its old stones cracked and crumbling, its windows darkened as if in mourning for some long-lost era. The building was immense, a hulking presence with turrets and steep roofs that gave it the look of a medieval fortress. Thick ivy crept up its sides, partially concealing the walls and giving it an eerie, organic look, as if the house were alive, swallowing itself in shadows. The first time I set foot inside, I was struck by the suffocating silence that seemed to wrap around every corner, swallowing up any sound I made. The air was thick, musty, with a faint undertone of something sour and metallic that lingered just out of reach, like a scent you can't quite place. It was as if Byron House had absorbed the sorrow and madness of its occupants over the years, they saturating the very walls with despair. I felt the weight of history pressing down on me, an almost physical presence that seemed to cling to my skin. Even the light seemed dimmer within those walls, as though daylight itself feared to intrude. The staff I met during those early days spoke little of the patients, and even less about the house itself. They were an unusual bunch, nurses, doctors, orderlies, all bearing a haunted look in their eyes, as if they'd seen things they couldn't unsee. They moved through the hallways with a quiet, almost reverent caution, whispering in hushed tones and avoiding eye contact, as if afraid of drawing attention from something unseen. It didn't take long to realize they'd developed their own set of superstitions about Byron House. Certain rooms they avoided, certain floors they only walked during daylight hours. They wouldn't speak of these habits directly, but the fear was etched unmistakably on their faces. One night, as I walked past the closed door of the attic stairs, I felt it. A cold draft, a faint echo of something that didn't belong. I'd heard the rumors about that door, about how it led to a forgotten attic room no one dared to enter. Even the most seasoned staff members refused to venture up those stairs, claiming to hear strange noises, whispers, footsteps, occasionally a soft, almost imperceptible moaning. The idea of an abandoned attic room filled me with dread, yet also a perverse excitement. There was something about the notion of a hidden room, tucked away from the world, that made my heart race. It was a mystery I couldn't ignore, a part of Byron House that beckoned to be explored. I became obsessed with the attic, with the idea that it held secrets no one else knew. The stories about 13 only fueled my curiosity, pushing me to question the other staff members in hopes of uncovering the truth. Most dismissed my inquiries with nervous laughter, shaking their heads and advising me to stay away from that place. But there was one nurse, Jane, who didn't brush off my curiosity so easily. She had worked at Byron House longer than anyone else and seemed to carry an unspoken burden, a knowledge she refused to share. One rainy evening, as thunder rumbled in the distance and lightning cast eerie shadows on the walls, I found myself alone with Jane in the dimly lit staff room. The rain pounded against the windows, filling the silence with a rhythmic, almost hypnotic beat. I took a deep breath and asked her about the attic. For a moment, she just stared at me, her eyes wide and dark, as though gazing into something far beyond me. When she finally spoke, her voice was low and strained. "There are things in this world, things that don't belong in the light," she said, her fingers tracing the edge of her coffee cup absently. "Byron House. It's more than just a hospital. Some places, they collect darkness like a sponge soaking up water. And once that darkness takes root, it's nearly impossible to cleanse it." She hesitated, then leaned closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "The attic, it's not a place for the living. No one goes up there, not anymore. There's a presence, something ancient and twisted that lives in the shadows. And 13, well, let's just say, he's not like the others." Her words sent a chill down my spine. For the first time, I felt the weight of what I was dealing with, the realization that Byron House was not just an institution, but a place where the very fabric of reality seemed to fray at the edges. Yet, despite the fear that gnawed at my stomach, I couldn't shake the urge to know more, to see for myself what lay hidden within those walls. As Jane's words lingered in my mind, I found myself torn between my rational mind and a dark curiosity that I couldn't ignore. I told myself that it was all nonsense, that there was a logical explanation for everything. But in the quiet hours of the night, when shadows stretched long and the house creaked and groaned with an unnatural life, I felt the pull of that attic door, the urge to uncover what everyone else feared. And so, against all warnings and better judgment, I made a vow to myself. One way or another, I would uncover the truth about Byron House and the mysterious inmate in the attic. It was a decision that would haunt me forever, leading me into a world of darkness and horror that I had never imagined. But as I would soon learn, some secrets are better left undisturbed. The first time I saw Byron House up close, it was late afternoon, and the sky was heavy with clouds. It loomed before me like a specter, an ancient structure hidden at the end of a winding road bordered by dark, tangled forests. The house seemed almost alive, its walls pulsing with a brooding energy, as if it held secrets too dreadful to share. The very air around it felt thick, charged with an unsettling tension that seemed to seep into my bones. Byron House was no ordinary building. It was a relic of another time, a place steeped in forgotten horrors and unsolved mysteries. The architecture of Byron House was a bizarre fusion of Gothic and Victorian elements, with tall, pointed turrets and narrow windows that seemed to leer down at visitors. Its walls were built from dark stone, now weathered and cracked, covered in ivy that twisted and writhed as though it had a life of its own. Gargoyles lined the edges of the roof, their twisted faces frozen in expressions of agony and menace, as if they were warning intruders to keep away. The windows were covered in grime, blocking out the sunlight and giving the interior a perpetual twilight, even in the middle of the day. Inside, Byron House was a labyrinthine maze of narrow hallways and creaking floorboards. The walls were painted in muted, peeling colors, as if time itself had drained the life from them. The air was thick, with the scent of mildew and something else, a metallic, almost coppery smell that lingered at the edge of awareness. Shadows clung to every corner, giving the impression that the house itself was watching, waiting. As I walked through its corridors for the first time, I felt a chill run down my spine. It was as if the house was testing me, gauging my resolve, deciding whether I was worthy of uncovering its secrets. The residents of Byron House were an unsettling presence in their own right. They moved through the halls with a quiet, almost ghostly grace, their expressions blank, their eyes hollow. Many were lost in their own minds, trapped in worlds of terror and despair. Some would mutter to themselves, their words barely audible, while others stared vacantly into space, their gazes fixed on something only they could see. There were occasional bursts of laughter, high-pitched, unnatural sounds that echoed through the halls, chilling me to the core. Each patient seemed to carry a piece of Byron House's darkness within them, as though the building had seeped into their souls, becoming a part of them. The staff was a somber group, seasoned and cautious, moving with a deliberate, almost ritualistic slowness. They avoided certain areas, especially the attic stairs and a small chapel at the back of the house, which had long been abandoned. There were unspoken rules, boundaries that everyone seemed to follow without question. I would see staff members glance at certain doorways with wary eyes, as if expecting something or someone to emerge. The staff rarely spoke of the patients or the house itself, and any questions I asked were met with evasive answers or stony silence. But Byron House held more than just patients and staff. There were rumors, stories that circulated among the residents of Barton, tales that painted the house as a place of darkness and horror long before it became an asylum. Some claimed that Byron House had once been the residence of a reclusive nobleman who dabbled in occult practices, performing rituals to summon forces beyond human comprehension. Others whispered of tragedies that had befallen those who lived there, mysterious deaths, disappearances, and suicides that had left a stain on the house's history. One story in particular haunted me, a tale of a young woman who had been found dead in the attic, her body twisted and contorted in a way that defied explanation. They said she had been experimenting with forbidden knowledge, trying to communicate with spirits from another realm. Her death had been ruled a suicide, but locals believed she had succeeded in her ritual and paid the price for her curiosity. The attic itself was a place of legend. Even among the staff, it was a topic they avoided, and any mention of it brought an uncomfortable silence. According to the stories, the attic had been sealed off for years, hidden behind a locked door at the end of a narrow staircase. It was said to contain artifacts from the house's past, old books, strange symbols carved into the walls, and a single dust-covered chair positioned in the center of the room. Those who had dared to enter claimed to have seen shadows that moved on their own, whispers that echoed through the empty space. Some reported seeing a figure, a man with hollow eyes who watched them from the darkness, his presence a cold, malevolent weight pressing down on them. But the most disturbing rumor of all was about the supposed 13th patient, an inmate known only as 13. No one seemed to know his real name, his background, or why he was confined to the attic. The staff avoided discussing him, and when they did, it was with an air of dread. It was said that 13 had been brought to Byron House after committing an unspeakable crime, something so horrific that the details were kept hidden. He was different from the other patients, they said, his mind broken in a way that defied treatment, as though he had been touched by something beyond this world. There were whispers that he was possessed, that he spoke in tongues and had knowledge of things no human should know. Some claimed he was a harbinger of death, a cursed soul who brought misfortune to anyone who crossed his path. The presence of 13 cast a shadow over Byron House, a reminder of the darkness that lay hidden within its walls. I would often hear faint, inexplicable sounds coming from the attic, the creak of footsteps, the soft murmur of a voice, and occasionally a low guttural moan that sent a chill down my spine. The staff would exchange uneasy glances, but no one dared investigate. It was as though the attic had become a separate entity, a place that existed outside the normal rules of reality, a domain ruled by fear and silence. As I settled into my role at Byron House, I found myself both repelled and drawn to its mysteries. The house seemed to come alive at night, its walls groaning and shifting as though it were a living, breathing creature. I would wander through the halls, listening to the sounds of the patients murmuring in their sleep, the creak of the floorboards, and the faint whisper of the wind outside. Each night, I felt the pull of the attic door, a silent invitation to uncover the secrets that lay hidden within. But I knew that stepping through that door would mean crossing a line, entering a world from which there might be no return. Despite my fear, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was meant to be there, that Byron House had been waiting for me. It was as if the house itself recognized my curiosity, my hunger for answers. And in the silent, shadowed halls of Byron House, I felt a kinship with its darkness, a shared understanding that whispered promises of forbidden knowledge. I knew that one day I would open that door, step into the attic, and confront whatever lay beyond. For Byron House was more than a mere building. It was a gateway, a place where the veil between worlds was thin, where the mind's darkest fears took shape and became real. It was a house of secrets, and I was determined to uncover every last one of them. There are places within Byron House that most staff avoid without question, paths they won't walk, and doors they won't open. No one explains it directly. It's simply an unspoken rule, understood through sidelong glances and murmured warnings. But as time passed, I couldn't ignore the most unsettling rumor that circled through the staff at Byron House. The presence of a secret inmate, known only as 13. The first time I heard of 13, it was in passing. Two orderlies, huddled near the staff kitchen, lowered their voices as I approached. They glanced at me briefly before quickly changing the subject, but not before I caught a whispered phrase that ignited my curiosity. Locked away in the attic. Those words stayed with me, haunting my thoughts as I went about my duties. A 13th inmate, locked away in an attic room, separated from the others. Who was he? Why was he kept apart, hidden as if he were some dangerous secret? As the days passed, I caught more fragments of conversation, hints that painted an increasingly ominous picture. Whispers of unnatural behavior and things no human should know drifted through the air, accompanied by furtive glances toward the attic stairs. The staff's faces grew tense whenever the topic surfaced, their eyes dark with something close to fear. They spoke of strange occurrences, eerie sounds that echoed through the hallways at night, and an unsettling aura that seemed to emanate from the attic itself. But beyond the fragments I overheard, no one seemed willing to discuss 13 openly. One evening, I found myself alone with Nurse Marjorie, a seasoned member of the staff who had been working at Byron House for nearly 2 decades. She was known for her sharp wit and cynicism, a woman who had seen it all and was never one to mince words. Yet there was something about the way she carried herself, an unspoken weariness that seemed to weigh on her, as though Byron House had eroded her spirit over the years. Marjorie was the kind of person who seemed immune to fear, hardened by years of witnessing the darkest aspects of the human mind. But even she, I sensed, harbored a profound unease about 13. Curiosity getting the better of me, I decided to ask her directly. One rainy night, as we sat in the dimly lit staff room with a pot of stale coffee between us, I broached the topic as casually as I could manage. Marjorie, have you ever heard about a 13th patient here? Someone in the attic? Her reaction was immediate. She stiffened, her face darkening as she turned her gaze away. She didn't speak at first, and for a long moment, I thought she would ignore the question altogether. But finally, she let out a weary sigh and looked back at me, her eyes narrowing with a mixture of irritation and caution. Listen, kid, she began, her voice low and edged with warning. If you have any sense, you'll stay away from that part of the house. Some things, they're best left alone. I pressed her gently, sensing that there was more to her reluctance than simple caution. Is it true, though? Is there really someone up there? A patient? Marjorie glanced around, as though ensuring we were truly alone, then leaned in closer. Her voice dropped to a whisper, thick with unease. You want to know about 13? Fine, but don't say I didn't warn you. She looked down at her hands, fingers twisting nervously. They brought him here a long time ago, long before you or I ever set foot in this place. He was different, even then. Something about him wasn't right. The doctors tried to treat him, tried every method they knew, but nothing worked. He wouldn't speak to them, wouldn't respond to treatment. He just existed, watching, and then things started happening. I could see the tension in her face, the weight of memories she would rather forget. Strange things, she continued. Things that no one could explain. People changed around him. There were accidents, breakdowns, patients and staff alike, and all of it seemed to circle back to him, to 13. Did you ever meet him? I asked, unable to keep the fascination from my voice. Marjorie's eyes clouded with a distant fear, her lips pressing together in a thin line. Once, she replied, her voice barely more than a whisper. Years ago, I was new then and curious, just like you. They had me bring him his meal. I never saw his face, but I felt something wrong. It was like looking into a void, a darkness so deep it seemed alive. I couldn't get out of that room fast enough. She paused, her expression softening with something almost like pity. I'm telling you, kid, don't go looking for answers. The attic is off limits for a reason. If you have any sense at all, you'll stay far away from that place. Her words should have deterred me, should have been enough to convince me that 13 was a mystery best left unsolved. But instead, they only fueled my curiosity. The idea that there was someone or something so terrifying that even the staff refused to speak of him was like a siren call, drawing me closer to the edge. I told myself it was just professional interest, a desire to understand the mind of a unique patient, but deep down, I knew it was more than that. I wanted to know who or what 13 truly was, to unravel the secrets that had been buried within Byron House for so long. Over the following weeks, my curiosity grew into an obsession. I found myself lingering near the attic stairs, listening for any hint of sound. At night, I would lie in bed, haunted by the thought of 13 in his attic room, a silent presence surrounded by darkness. I began experiencing strange dreams, vivid and unsettling, where I would find myself standing before a door that I couldn't bring myself to open. In these dreams, a sense of dread would fill me, a certainty that something waited on the other side, something that knew I was there, that could sense my fear. During my shifts, I felt an odd sensation, as if someone were watching me from the shadows. I would catch glimpses of movement at the corner of my vision, shadows that seemed to dart away whenever I turned to look. My skin would prickle with an eerie cold, a shiver running down my spine as I approached the stairs. The other staff members noticed my preoccupation, though they rarely commented on it. Marjorie, however, wasn't so silent. One evening, as I stood near the base of the attic stairs, she approached me, her face set in a grim expression. Still poking around, I see, she said, her tone laced with disapproval. I thought I told you to leave that place alone. I managed a weak smile, hoping to mask the unease I felt. It's just, I can't help it. There's something about it, Marjorie, I need to know. She shook her head, a look of resignation in her eyes. Curiosity is a dangerous thing, especially here. This place has a way of taking what you want to know and turning it into something you wish you hadn't. But even her words of caution did little to quell the growing obsession within me. I was drawn to the attic, to the mystery of 13, as if an invisible thread were pulling me closer, The rumors, the whispers, the stories, they had all created a picture of a being that defied understanding, a patient whose very existence seemed to challenge the boundaries of reality. And the more I learned, the more I felt compelled to see him for myself. One night, as I lay in bed, I was overcome by a sudden urge to go to the attic. The thought of 13 waiting there, hidden away from the world, filled me with a strange exhilaration. I knew I shouldn't, knew that I was risking everything, but my need to know had grown beyond reason. Ignoring the chill that crept over my skin, I threw on my jacket and stepped into the hallway, the house silent and dark around me. The corridor stretched before me, a long, narrow passage that led to the base of the attic stairs. My footsteps echoed softly, each step pulling me deeper into the silence. Shadows flickered at the edge of my vision, dark shapes that seemed to move with a life of their own, watching, waiting. I felt a cold sweat prickling on my skin, a shiver running down my spine as I approached the stairs. And there it was, the attic door, looming at the top of the staircase like a mouth waiting to swallow me whole. My heart hammered in my chest, a deep, instinctive fear warning me to turn back, to flee before it was too late. But I couldn't. Something beyond my control had taken hold of me, a force stronger than reason or fear. I placed my hand on the doorknob, feeling the cold metal beneath my fingers. I could sense something on the other side, a presence that felt ancient and patient, as though it had been waiting for me all along. For a moment I hesitated, my mind racing with doubts, memories of Marjorie's warning echoing in my ears. But then, in a single defiant movement, I turned the handle and opened the door. The darkness inside was thick, oppressive, wrapping around me like a shroud. I stepped inside, my footsteps muffled by the thick dust that coated the floor. Shadows shifted around me, darting and merging in strange patterns, as if the darkness itself were alive. And then I saw him. 13 was no longer merely a patient confined to a hidden room in the attic. He was something else entirely. His form was human, or at least it had once been, but now it was something twisted and unrecognizable, a pulsating mass that seemed to shift and writhe as though barely held together by the shape of a man. His skin was pale and sickly, stretched taut over bones that jutted out at odd angles, giving him a skeletal, almost corpse-like appearance. His face was a mess of scars and fissures, as if it had been broken and reassembled by someone who had only a vague understanding of human anatomy. But it was his eyes that held me captive. They were wide and unblinking, dark as obsidian, with a depth that seemed to pull me in, as if I were staring into an endless void. There was something unnatural about them, a lightless quality that felt like looking into the core of some ancient, forgotten abyss. His gaze pierced through me, filling my mind with an overwhelming sense of terror and despair. As I stared, transfixed, 13 began to move, his body contorting and undulating in ways that defied logic. His limbs seemed to stretch and contract, as though they were made of something not quite solid, something that could shift and reshape at will. The shadows around him pulsed in time with his movements, as if he were the center of a dark, malevolent energy that fed on the darkness itself. I felt my pulse quicken, my throat tightening as I fought to hold on to the remnants of my rational mind. What are you? I managed to whisper, though my voice sounded small and weak in the vast emptiness of the attic. A twisted smile spread across his face, stretching his lips into an unnatural grin that revealed rows of jagged, broken teeth. His voice, when he spoke, was low and guttural, more a vibration than a sound, reverberating through the air like a discordant hum. It was a voice that seemed to bypass the ears and go straight to the soul, filling me with a cold, unrelenting dread. "I am a mirror," he murmured, each word a struggle as if he were speaking from some far-off place. "A reflection of what lies beneath the mind's surface, of the things you fear, but refuse to see." The room seemed to tilt, the walls shifting and blurring as his words seeped into my mind. It was as if reality itself were bending around him, warping and twisting in response to his presence. I felt an overwhelming urge to look away, to escape the unbearable pressure of his gaze, but I couldn't. My eyes were locked on his, trapped in that endless abyss. Images began to flicker through my mind, images that defied logic, that felt both ancient and eternal. I saw flashes of dark, empty landscapes, barren and lifeless, stretching out beneath a sky devoid of stars. I saw shadowy figures moving through the darkness, their forms shifting and merging, as if they were part of some endless cycle of death and rebirth. And amidst it all, I saw him, 13, standing at the center, his eyes glowing with a light that was not light, a darkness that held the weight of ages. A cold, sick feeling washed over me as I realized what I was seeing. It was a glimpse into something beyond human understanding, a truth so horrifying that my mind recoiled from it. I was staring into the face of madness itself, into a place where reality unraveled and gave way to something primal and unspeakable. 13 reached out, his hand extending toward me, the skin stretched thin over his long, bony fingers. I felt a wave of nausea as his fingers brushed against my skin, a cold, slimy sensation that made me want to pull away to escape his touch. But his grip tightened, and in that moment, I felt a surge of energy, a wave of something dark and powerful that seemed to seep into my very being. His voice echoed in my mind, a whisper that sounded like 1,000 voices overlapping, each one speaking in a different language, a different tone. "You wanted answers," he murmured, his voice a chilling caress against my thoughts. "You wanted to know, to see, and now you have. But knowledge comes with a price." I felt a sharp pain in my head, a splitting agony that seemed to tear through my thoughts, unraveling them like frayed threads. Images and sounds collided in my mind, fragments of memories and fears merging into a chaotic tapestry of horror. I could feel my sanity slipping, my mind teetering on the edge of some vast, endless chasm. With a final, desperate surge of willpower, I pulled myself free from his grip, stumbling backward as I gasped for air. My vision blurred, the room spinning around me as I fought to steady myself. 13 watched me, his gaze filled with a dark amusement, as though he had seen it all before, as though he knew the madness that awaited me. I turned and fled, my footsteps echoing in the empty corridor as I stumbled down the stairs, my heart pounding, my mind a shattered mirror of images and sounds that defied comprehension. Behind me, I could still feel his presence, a dark, lingering weight that would haunt me for the rest of my days. I had come seeking answers, seeking understanding. But in that single, shattering moment, I realized the terrible truth. Some things are meant to remain hidden. Some mysteries are best left unsolved. And in my pursuit of knowledge, I had glimpsed a darkness that could never be unseen, a horror that would follow me like a shadow, a constant reminder of the cost of my curiosity. As I stumbled out of Byron House into the cold night air, I knew that I would never be the same. The night I finally took over Jane's shift was one of those evenings when the wind howled through the cracks in Iron House's stone walls, sounding eerily like distant, tormented wails. Shadows stretched long and restless across the hallway, and every creak of the floorboards seemed amplified, echoing through the empty corridors. I had spent days preparing myself, convincing myself that my curiosity outweighed the dread gnawing at me. But now that I was here, alone on the night shift, I felt an undercurrent of something primal, a cold, insistent fear that I couldn't quite shake. It was Jane's unfortunate cold that had opened up this opportunity, though I couldn't shake the feeling that she had feigned it on purpose to avoid another night near the attic. I could almost hear her mocking voice in my mind, warning me yet again to leave well enough alone, but no amount of warning could have swayed me. My obsession with 13 had grown beyond reason, and tonight, with Jane away, I had a rare opportunity to attend to him myself. The clock struck midnight, its chime reverberating through the hallways like a death knell. I was alone in the dim, silent corridors of Byron House, the rest of the patients safely asleep, or at least confined to their rooms. The air was thick with anticipation, a weight pressing down on me as I made my way toward the attic stairs. My every step seemed louder than it should have been, each echo a reminder of the empty space around me, as if the house itself was holding its breath. The atmosphere grew colder, and as I approached the attic door, I heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible sound coming from behind the door. A scratching, skittering noise that seemed to claw its way into my mind. My pulse quickened, my breath felt shallow, and I felt a trickle of sweat down my spine. Logic tried to reassert itself, insisting that it was just the building settling, but the sound had an organic quality to it, something alive. My hands shook slightly as I reached out to the door, feeling the cold metal of the doorknob under my palm. I had just pressed my ear to the door when I noticed it. A small folded piece of paper slipped under the door, lying there as if waiting for me. I hesitated, staring at it, my mind racing. I hadn't seen anyone approach, hadn't heard a single footstep. Heart pounding, I reached down and picked up the paper, unfolding it with trembling fingers. The note was written in a jagged, uneven script, as though whoever had written it was struggling to control their hand. It was disjointed, fragmented, the words tumbling over each other in a chaotic, barely legible scrawl. I know you're here. They told me you'd come. You're curious, aren't you? But curiosity is dangerous. They showed me things that can't be unseen, shadows and whispers, truths that shatter the mind. The door is open, but you'll wish it wasn't. My hands shook as I read the note, my stomach twisting with a mixture of horror and fascination. The words seemed to pulse on the page, their meaning seeping into my mind like poison. The note was unsigned, but somehow I knew it could only have come from 13. It was as if he had been expecting me, waiting for this very moment. Suddenly, a low, guttural noise sounded from beyond the door, a sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was a sound that defied description, something between a growl and a sigh, resonant with a depth that seemed to vibrate through my bones. I felt a surge of dread, every instinct screaming at me to turn and run, to leave Byron House and never look back. But I was rooted to the spot, unable to move, drawn toward the door as though some invisible force had taken hold of me. Taking a deep breath, I turned the knob and pushed the door open. The attic was shrouded in darkness, a thick, almost palpable gloom that seemed to swallow the light from my flashlight. The air was dense, heavy with a scent I couldn't place, metallic and faintly sweet, like decaying flowers mixed with iron. I stepped inside, my footsteps muffled by the thick dust that coated the floor. Shadows shifted around me, darting and merging in strange patterns, as if the darkness itself were alive. And then I saw him. 13 was no longer merely a patient confined to a hidden room in the attic. He was something else entirely. His form was human, or at least it had once been, but now it was something twisted and unrecognizable, a pulsating mass that seemed to shift and writhe as though barely held together by the shape of a man. His skin was pale and sickly, stretched taut over bones that jutted out at odd angles, giving him a skeletal, almost corpse-like appearance. His face was a mess of scars and fissures, as if it had been broken and reassembled by someone who had only a vague understanding of human anatomy. But it was his eyes that held me captive. They were wide and unblinking, dark as obsidian, with a depth that seemed to pull me in, as if I were staring into an endless void. There was something unnatural about them, a lightless quality that felt like looking into the core of some ancient, forgotten abyss. His gaze pierced through me, filling my mind with an overwhelming sense of terror and despair. As I stared, transfixed, 13 began to move, his body contorting and undulating in ways that defied logic. His limbs seemed to stretch and contract, as though they were made of something not quite solid, something that could shift and reshape at will. The shadows around him pulsed in time with his movements, as if he were the center of a dark, malevolent energy that fed on the darkness itself. I felt my pulse quicken, my throat tightening as I fought to hold on to the remnants of my rational mind. What are you? I managed to whisper, though my voice sounded small and weak in the vast emptiness of the attic. A twisted smile spread across his face, stretching his lips into an unnatural grin that revealed rows of jagged, broken teeth. His voice, when he spoke, was low and guttural, more a vibration than a sound, reverberating through the air like a discordant hum. It was a voice that seemed to bypass the ears and go straight to the soul, filling me with a cold, unrelenting dread. "I am a mirror," he murmured, each word a struggle, as if he were speaking from some far-off place. "A reflection of what lies beneath the mind's surface, of the things you fear, but refuse to see." The room seemed to tilt, the walls shifting and blurring as his words seeped into my mind. It was as if reality itself were bending around him, warping and twisting in response to his presence. I felt an overwhelming urge to look away, to escape the unbearable pressure of his gaze, but I couldn't. My eyes were locked on his, trapped in that endless abyss. Images began to flicker through my mind, images that defied logic, that felt both ancient and eternal. I saw flashes of dark, empty landscapes, barren and lifeless, stretching out beneath a sky devoid of stars. I saw shadowy figures moving through the darkness, their forms shifting and merging, as if they were part of some endless cycle of death and rebirth. And amidst it all, I saw him, 13, standing at the center, his eyes glowing with a light that was not light, a darkness that held the weight of ages. A cold, sick feeling washed over me as I realized what I was seeing. It was a glimpse into something beyond human understanding, a truth so horrifying that my mind recoiled from it. I was staring into the face of madness itself, into a place where reality unraveled and gave way to something primal and unspeakable. 13 reached out, his hand extending toward me, the skin stretched thin over his long, bony fingers. I felt a wave of nausea as his fingers brushed against my skin, a cold, slimy sensation that made me want to pull away to escape his touch. But his grip tightened, and in that moment I felt a surge of energy, a wave of something dark and powerful that seemed to seep into my very being. His voice echoed in my mind, a whisper that sounded like 1,000 voices overlapping, each one speaking in a different language, a different tone. "You wanted answers," he murmured, his voice a chilling caress against my thoughts. "You wanted to know, to see, and now you have. But knowledge comes with a price." I felt a sharp pain in my head, a splitting agony that seemed to tear through my thoughts, unraveling them like frayed threads. Images and sounds collided in my mind, fragments of memories and fears merging into a chaotic tapestry of horror. I could feel my sanity slipping, my mind teetering on the edge of some vast, endless chasm. With a final, desperate surge of willpower, I pulled myself free from his grip, stumbling backward as I gasped for air. My vision blurred, the room spinning around me as I fought to steady myself. 13 watched me, his gaze filled with a dark amusement, as though he had seen it all before, as though he knew the madness that awaited me. I turned and fled, my footsteps echoing in the empty corridor as I stumbled down the stairs, my heart pounding, my mind a shattered mirror of images and sounds that defied comprehension. Behind me, I could still feel his presence, a dark, lingering weight that would haunt me for the rest of my days. I had come seeking answers, seeking understanding, but in that single shattering moment, I realized the terrible truth. Some things are meant to remain hidden. Some mysteries are best left unsolved. And in my pursuit of knowledge, I had glimpsed a darkness that could never be unseen. A horror that would follow me like a shadow, a constant reminder of the cost of my curiosity. As I stumbled out of Byron House into the cold night air, I knew that I would never be the same. After my first encounter with 13, I couldn't shake the darkness that seemed to cling to me, wrapping around my thoughts like a heavy fog. I'd fled Byron House that night, stumbling into the streets, gasping for air, yet even the cold night wind couldn't clear the taint left by his touch. It felt as though he had left a piece of himself lodged in my mind, a dark seed that took root and began to fester, spreading like a poison. I tried to tell myself it was over, that I could walk away and pretend it had never happened. But deep down, I knew the truth. I had crossed a line, and there was no turning back. In the days that followed, my behavior changed in ways that I barely recognized. My colleagues noticed first. They would throw concerned glances my way as I muttered to myself, my eyes darting around as if expecting to see something lurking in the shadows. Sleep became a distant memory. Every time I closed my eyes, I was haunted by visions of 13, his dark, endless eyes pulling me into a void filled with monstrous shapes and twisting shadows. I would wake drenched in sweat, gasping, my heart racing as though I had run miles. The dreams were relentless, each one more vivid and grotesque than the last. Strange symbols carved into stone walls, creature eyes that gleamed like dying stars, and a voice, low, guttural, whispering words I couldn't understand but somehow knew were meant for me. The lack of sleep began to take its toll. I became irritable, snapping at colleagues for the smallest things. I could feel the strain building inside me, a constant tension that left me on edge, ready to lash out at the slightest provocation. My hands would shake when I tried to perform even the simplest tasks, and my reflection in the mirror looked like a stranger. Hollow, sunken eyes, skin pale and drawn like someone who had seen things that couldn't be unseen. And in a way, that was exactly what I was. My obsession with 13 grew with each passing day. I couldn't stop thinking about him, about the darkness that seemed to radiate from his very being, a darkness that felt ancient and unyielding. Questions circled endlessly in my mind, questions that refused to be silenced. Who was he? What was he? How had he come to Byron House, and what connection did he have to the strange, twisted energy that permeated the building? The more I tried to ignore it, the more insistent these questions became, gnawing at me until I was forced to confront them. I began to search for answers in the only place I knew, the archives of Byron House. Late at night, when the corridors were empty and the building lay silent, I would make my way to the basement, where old files and records were stored in dusty boxes. The air down there was thick, stale, heavy with the scent of mold and decay, but I barely noticed. I would pore over patient records, old journals, anything that might give me a hint about 13's past. But as I soon discovered, the official records were frustratingly vague. It was as if someone had gone through and purged any real information about him, leaving only traces of his existence, shadowed references, and cryptic notes. Frustrated, I turned to more unconventional sources. It was during one of my nights in the basement that I came across a box labeled Special Cases. Inside were a handful of books, their covers worn and stained, the titles barely legible. I pulled them out, one by one. My curiosity piqued. They were old, some centuries old, with pages yellowed and fragile. As I flipped through them, I realized they weren't medical texts or official documents. They were something else entirely. One was a grimoire filled with strange symbols and spells written in languages I didn't recognize. Another was a collection of texts on occult practices, with references to ancient gods and mythical beings, creatures that had once walked the earth, but were now consigned to shadow. One book in particular caught my eye, a volume bound in black leather titled The Nocturnus Codex. The name alone sent a shiver down my spine. I opened it, my fingers tracing the faded, spidery text, and began to read. It was a compendium of myths, but these were not the familiar tales of gods and heroes. They were dark, twisted accounts of beings that had never been meant to walk the earth, entities that existed beyond the edge of human understanding. The book spoke of the forgotten ones, creatures of shadow and void, whose very presence corrupted reality. They were described as ancient spirits of chaos, beings that could reshape the mind, drive it to madness with a single glance. As I read, I felt a growing certainty that 13 was somehow connected to these beings, that he was either a vessel or a harbinger of their power. The descriptions in the Nocturnus Codex matched the aura of darkness I had felt in his presence. The oppressive weight, the suffocating fear, the sense that he was not bound by the same reality that governed the rest of us. And yet I couldn't stop reading. The more I learned, the deeper my obsession became. My search for answers took me to libraries and old bookstores, places where the dust lay thick and the books carried the weight of forgotten knowledge. I would spend hours hunched over faded manuscripts, reading by dim, flickering lights as I uncovered references to cults that had worshipped beings like 13, cults that believed in the power of darkness, in the allure of forbidden knowledge. They spoke of rituals that could summon these beings, that could open doorways to other worlds, realms where reality and nightmare merged. One name kept appearing in my research, a name that filled me with a strange dread each time I read it. The Brotherhood of Yigaloth. They were a shadowy group, shrouded in secrecy, who believed that true power lay in embracing the darkness within oneself, in surrendering to the forces that humanity had long shunned. The Brotherhood's writings spoke of initiations held in ancient crypts, of rituals that involved offerings of blood and fire, sacrifices made to beings that had slumbered beneath the earth for eons. After my encounter with 13, I couldn't shake him from my mind. The darkness he carried clung to me like a second skin, suffocating, inescapable. I fled Byron House that night, stumbling through empty streets, gasping for air, but even the cold night couldn't purge his presence from my thoughts. It was as if he'd planted something inside me, a seed of shadow that began to sprout, its roots twisting deep into my psyche. I told myself it was over, that I could walk away and forget. But deep down, I knew I had crossed a threshold, and there was no turning back. Days blurred together as I spiraled deeper. Colleagues cast worried glances my way as I muttered under my breath, my eyes darting to shadows that seemed to move on their own. Sleep eluded me. Every time I closed my eyes, 13 was there, pulling me into nightmares where shapes writhed and voices whispered in tongues I didn't understand. I'd jolt awake, heart pounding, drenched in sweat. The visions were relentless, symbols carved into cold stone, eyes gleaming in the dark, his voice echoing like a haunting refrain. Exhaustion gnawed at me. I snapped at anyone who tried to talk to me, irritation flaring without warning. My hands trembled when I tried to perform even simple tasks. The face staring back from the mirror was gaunt, eyes sunken, unrecognizable. Was this really me? I couldn't stop thinking about him, about the oppressive aura that surrounded him, ancient and unfathomable. Questions swirled endlessly. Who was he? What was he? How did he come to be at Byron House? The more I pondered, the more the need for answers consumed me. Ignoring it was impossible. It was like trying to hold back a tide. Desperation drove me to the archives. Late at night, when the asylum was hushed and still, I'd descend into the basement, sifting through dusty records and forgotten files. The air was thick with decay, but I didn't care. I needed to find something, anything, that could explain 13. But the records were incomplete, fragmented. It was as if someone had deliberately erased his existence, leaving only traces that led nowhere. Frustration mounting, I sought answers elsewhere. One night, I stumbled upon a box labeled Special Cases. Inside were old books, grimoires, texts on the occult, writings that most would dismiss as superstition. One stood out, the Nocturnus Codex. My hands shook as I opened it. The pages were filled with arcane symbols and accounts of beings that existed beyond our reality. Entities that could twist minds, warp perceptions, a darkness that consumed all. A chilling realization settled in. 13 wasn't just a patient, he was connected to something far more sinister. The descriptions matched the oppressive energy I'd felt, the ancient dread that seemed to emanate from him. But instead of deterring me, it pulled me deeper. I had to know more. I scoured hidden corners of libraries, seeking texts long forgotten. Hours slipped away as I delved into forbidden knowledge, my obsession eclipsing all else. Sleep was a distant memory. Food lost its appeal. My colleagues avoided me. Their whispers followed me through the halls. Even Marjorie kept her distance, her eyes reflecting a concern she no longer voiced. Reality began to fray. Shadows danced at the edge of my vision. Whispers echoed in empty rooms. His presence was constant, a shadow I couldn't escape. I was unraveling, and part of me didn't care. I was too close. Too close to stop now. A name surfaced repeatedly in my research. Shra, the Brotherhood of Yigoloth, a cult devoted to dark entities seeking to bridge our world and theirs. Byron House wasn't just an asylum, it was a nexus, a place where the veil was thin. Dr. Monroe hadn't founded it to heal minds. He'd created it to explore the very darkness that now consumed me. Horror and fascination warred within me. I was entangled in something vast and malignant, but the answers were so near. I could feel them, just beyond reach. Staring into the mirror, I barely recognized the person I'd become. Hollow eyes, a haunted gaze. Was this the price of knowledge? Yet, even as fear tightened its grip, determination burned hotter. I had to return to Byron House. I had to confront the darkness to see this through to whatever end awaited. I was on the edge of an abyss, and the abyss was staring back. Byron House was changing, or perhaps it was me. I could no longer tell where the boundary between the asylum's peculiarities and my own unraveling mind lay. But one thing was certain. Something dark and inexplicable was happening here, something beyond the pale of human understanding. Strange occurrences had always been part of Byron House, but now they seemed to be drawn to me, as if the place sensed my obsession and fed off it. It began with the lights. They would flicker erratically whenever I entered certain hallways, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and warp on the walls. At first, I dismissed it as faulty wiring, a reasonable explanation in a place as old as Byron House. But as the days passed, the flickering grew more intense, more deliberate. The lights would dim and flare, as if responding to my presence, pulsing with a rhythm that matched my racing heart. Then came the voices. I would hear them in the dead of night, faint whispers drifting through the empty corridors. The words were too soft to make out, but there was an unmistakable tone of warning, an urgency that filled me with a sense of foreboding. Sometimes I would catch a glimpse of a shadow flitting past the corner of my eye, a dark shape that vanished the moment I turned to look. It was as if the shadows themselves were watching me, drawn to the darkness that had taken root within me. The patients, too, began to act strangely. They seemed to sense the change in me, their eyes following me with a mixture of fear and recognition. Some would mutter strange, disjointed phrases as I passed, phrases that echoed the words I had read in the Nocturnus Codex and the texts of the Brotherhood of Eagleoth. One night, as I was making my rounds, an elderly patient named Miss Abernathy reached out and grabbed my arm, her grip surprisingly strong for someone so frail. "You've seen him, haven't you?" she whispered, her eyes wide and haunted. "He's shown you the truth, the things that lurk in the shadows, but you can't unsee it. None of us can." I pulled away, unnerved by her words, but the fear in her eyes stayed with me. It was as if she knew, as if she too had glimpsed the darkness that lay hidden within Byron House. And she wasn't the only one. Others would stop mid-sentence, their eyes glazing over as they stared at something only they could see, muttering phrases that filled me with a sense of dread. The house was alive with whispers, shadows, and secrets, each one drawing me closer to a truth I wasn't sure I wanted to know. One night, as I walked past the attic stairs, I heard it again, the faint, scraping sound that had haunted me since my first encounter with 13. It was coming from beyond the door, a rhythmic, insistent noise that seemed to echo through the silence. My heart pounded, my breath quickening as I stood there listening. The urge to open the door, to confront whatever lay on the other side was overwhelming, but a deep-seated fear held me back, a primal instinct that warned me of the consequences. Yet the sound persisted, growing louder, more frantic, as if something on the other side were desperate to be free. I backed away, my hands trembling, and fled down the corridor, the noise following me, echoing in my mind long after I had returned to my quarters. The nights grew darker, the shadows thicker, until it felt as though Byron House itself were closing in on me. I could feel 13's presence everywhere, a weight pressing down on my soul that filling me with an unbearable sense of dread. The dreams returned, more vivid and grotesque than ever, visions of twisted landscapes and monstrous beings, of shadows that reached out with clawed hands, pulling me into an abyss from which there was no escape. One night, as I lay in bed, my mind teetering on the edge of sleep, I felt it, a presence in the room, a cold, suffocating energy that sent a shiver down my spine. I opened my eyes, and there, standing at the foot of my bed, was a figure cloaked in darkness. I couldn't make out his features, but I knew with a sickening certainty that it was him. 13. He stood there, silent and unmoving, his form blending into the shadows, his eyes, those dark, endless eyes, boring into mine, filling my mind with a whirlwind of terror and despair. I tried to scream, but no sound came. My body was frozen, paralyzed by his gaze, as though he had reached into my mind and seized control. His voice echoed in my thoughts, a low, rumbling whisper that filled me with a sense of impending doom. "You wanted to know," he murmured, each word vibrating through my skull. "You wanted the truth, and now you shall have it." With that, he was gone, leaving me gasping for air, my body drenched in sweat. But his words lingered, a promise or a curse that I couldn't escape. I knew then that my time was running out. Whatever 13 had shown me, whatever darkness he had awakened within me, was spiraling toward an inevitable conclusion. And I couldn't stop it. I could only wait, helpless, as the shadows closed in. The final confrontation came one stormy night, when the wind howled through the cracks in Byron House and lightning cast jagged shadows across the walls. I had been avoiding the attic, staying as far away from 13 as possible, but that night, something drew me there. A compulsion I couldn't resist. The house was silent, the corridors empty, as I made my way up the stairs, each step heavy with the weight of fate. The door to the attic was slightly ajar, as if inviting me in. I hesitated, a surge of fear clawing at my chest, but the compulsion was too strong. I pushed the door open and stepped inside, my flashlight flickering as the darkness closed around me. The attic was different this time. The air was thick, almost tangible, filled with a stifling heat that made it hard to breathe. Shadows writhed in the corners, twisting and merging as if alive. And there at the center of the room was 13. He was no longer the man I had glimpsed in our first encounter. His form had shifted, become something monstrous, a writhing mass of shadow and flesh, his features distorted and fragmented. His eyes gleamed in the darkness, twin voids that seemed to pull the light from the room, filling it with an unnatural darkness. His body pulsed, shifting and twisting as though barely contained within its human shape, a grotesque fusion of man and nightmare. I tried to speak, to ask him what he wanted, but my voice failed me. I could only stand there, frozen, as he began to move toward me, each step slow and deliberate, his gaze never leaving mine. The air grew colder, the shadows deepening until it felt as though I were sinking into an abyss. "You sought the truth," he whispered, his voice a low, resonant hum that filled the room. "And now you will see." In that moment, the world around me seemed to dissolve, reality unraveling like a thread pulled from a fraying tapestry. I was no longer in the attic, no longer in Byron House. I was somewhere else. A vast, empty space filled with darkness, a void that stretched out into infinity. Shadows moved around me, grotesque shapes with eyes that glowed like embers, their forms twisting and contorting as they closed in. And then I saw him, 13, standing at the center of it all, his form shifting and expanding, merging with the shadows. He was no longer bound by human shape, no longer constrained by the limits of flesh. He was something else, something ancient and incomprehensible, a being that existed beyond the boundaries of reality. The knowledge flooded my mind, a torrent of images and sounds that defied understanding. I saw glimpses of ancient rites, of blood spilled in darkened chambers, of shadows that moved with a life of their own. I saw beings that had existed before time, creatures of shadow and void that whispered secrets into the minds of men, driving them to madness. I saw Byron House, a sanctuary for those touched by the darkness, a place where the veil between worlds had thinned, allowing the horrors of the other side to seep through. And then, in a flash of terrible clarity, I understood. 13 was not simply a patient, not simply a man touched by madness. He was a vessel, a conduit for something far older and more powerful, a darkness that had existed since the beginning of time. He was bound to Byron House, drawn to its shadows, feeding off its secrets. And now, he had chosen me, pulled me into his world, a realm where nightmare and reality merged. I felt a surge of terror, my mind buckling under the weight of the knowledge he had shown me. I tried to pull away, to escape the darkness that surrounded me, but it was too late. I was trapped, ensnared by his gaze, by the power that radiated from him like a dark sun. "Embrace it," he whispered, his voice filling my mind. "Embrace the darkness, for it is part of you now." With a final desperate cry, I broke free, stumbling backward as reality snapped back into focus. I was in the attic once more, gasping for air, my body trembling. 13 stood before me, his form flickering, his eyes filled with a dark, triumphant gleam. "You cannot escape it," he murmured, his voice echoing in the silence. "You have seen the truth, and now it will haunt you as it has haunted me." I stumbled back, my mind reeling, the weight of what I had seen pressing down on me. I fled from the attic, from Byron House, the knowledge of 13's revelation seared into my mind. The shadows had claimed me, and I knew, with a sickening certainty, that they would follow me, haunting my thoughts, my dreams, forever. As I left Byron House behind, I felt the darkness linger, a constant, silent presence at the edge of my vision, a reminder of the truth I could never unsee. And in the silence that followed, I heard his voice, a final whisper that echoed in my mind, a promise of the horror that awaited. "Once you see the darkness," he had said, "it becomes part of you." And as I walked away, I knew that I would never be free. As I left Byron House behind, the world outside seemed unchanged, indifferent, as though it hadn't witnessed the horrors that lay within those walls. The normalcy of the outside felt foreign to me now, as if I had stepped from one dimension into another, leaving part of myself behind. I felt hollow, like a shell containing only shadows and fragments of memories that clung to me, gnawing at my thoughts. I wanted to believe that I could leave it all behind, that I could shake free of the experiences I had endured, but I knew that I would never be the same. Days turned into weeks, and yet the memories of Byron House lingered like ghosts, haunting my every moment. It wasn't only the things I had seen that troubled me. It was the change within myself that filled me with dread. I had looked into the depths of something unknowable, something dark and ancient, and it had left its mark on me, staining my thoughts and twisting my perceptions. I began to see things that others couldn't see, shadows flitting at the edges of my vision, faint whispers that spoke in languages I couldn't understand, fragments of memories that I was certain weren't my own. My mind, once a haven of reason and logic, had become a fractured mirror, reflecting images of things I couldn't comprehend. The world around me no longer held the same shape or meaning. I felt like a stranger in my own life, an outsider looking in, disconnected from the ordinary rhythms of existence. Simple things, conversations with friends, the warmth of the sun, the laughter of strangers, seemed distant, muffled, as though I were watching them through a thick pane of glass. I couldn't relate to others anymore, couldn't bring myself to pretend that the horrors I had seen hadn't forever altered me. The people around me, innocent of the dark truths lurking beneath reality's surface, seemed fragile, unknowing, blissfully oblivious to the shadows that waited, just out of sight. Sleep became my enemy, a gateway to the nightmares that had woven themselves into my mind. Each night, I would descend into dreams filled with distorted landscapes, ancient, crumbling temples, and monstrous beings whose eyes gleamed with a hunger that no mortal could fathom. I would wake gasping, my heart pounding, my skin damp with sweat, the images still lingering in my mind, refusing to fade. I tried to avoid sleep, filling my nights with endless distractions, but the exhaustion only deepened the chasm between myself and the rest of the world. The line between reality and nightmare blurred, and soon I could no longer tell where one ended and the other began. I found myself reflecting often on the path that had led me to Byron House, on the curiosity that had driven me to seek out knowledge that I was never meant to possess. I had always been drawn to mysteries, to the hidden and the unknown, believing that understanding could illuminate the darkest corners of existence. But my time at Byron House had taught me a painful truth. There are things in this world that defy understanding, things that exist beyond the boundaries of human reason. I had thought that knowledge would grant me power, that it would bring me closer to some ultimate truth, but instead it had shattered my perception of reality, leaving me adrift in a sea of existential dread. Curiosity is a seductive force, one that lures us into depths we were never meant to explore. I hadn't fathomed the cost, the price of seeking answers in the darkest of places. I gazed into the abyss, and it gazed back, imprinting itself upon my very soul. The knowledge I gained wasn't empowering, it was corrosive, eroding the foundations of my mind and leaving me questioning the very fabric of reality. I glimpsed something humanity was never meant to see, perhaps something beyond comprehension, and it changed me forever. As the months passed, I began to grasp the true cost of forbidden knowledge. The darkness I encountered wasn't just an entity confined to Byron House. It became a part of me, an indelible mark on my psyche, a shadow trailing me wherever I went. It wove itself into the fabric of my being, coloring my thoughts, distorting my perceptions. The more I tried to distance myself, the tighter its hold became, constricting my very soul like a relentless noose. In moments of stark clarity, I reflect on the allure of darkness, the seductive pull of forbidden truths. There's an irresistible appeal to the unknown, a magnetic force drawing us in with whispers of hidden knowledge, of mysteries just beyond reach. Yet that allure is a trap, a siren's call, leading to an abyss from which there's no return. The darkness offers secrets but exacts a steep toll. Our innocence, our peace, our sanity. It strips away the comforting illusions that shield us from reality's harsh truths, leaving us vulnerable, exposed, utterly alone. I came to realize the world is veiled in mysteries for a reason. Some truths are meant to remain hidden, buried in shadows, guarded by forces beyond human understanding. There's a line that should never be crossed, a boundary separating our world from realms of terror and despair. Yet, in our arrogance, we press forward, driven by a need to know, to understand, to conquer. I crossed that line, stepped into forbidden territory, and now I'm paying the price. Looking back, I see the warning signs. The moments when I could have turned away, heeded the advice of those who understood the perils. But I ignored them, believing I was different, that I could withstand whatever secrets Byron House held. My curiosity was my downfall, my undoing, a force that led me into a darkness that will haunt me for the rest of my life. The scars left by my experiences weren't visible, but they ran deep, etched into the very core of my being. I had glimpsed a reality that lay beyond the comforting illusions of everyday life. A realm where darkness reigned, where ancient beings and forgotten horrors lurked, waiting for those foolish enough to seek them out. And now I was marked, branded by the knowledge I had gained, forever bound to the shadows that had claimed me. In the end, my experience at Byron House had taught me one final, painful lesson. Some mysteries are not meant to be solved. Some truths are better left unknown. There is a darkness in this world that we are not equipped to face, a darkness that exists outside the realm of human understanding. And those who seek it out, who venture into its depths, do so at their own peril, for the darkness does not give up its secrets lightly. It exacts a toll, a price that can never be repaid, leaving those who seek it shattered, haunted, forever changed. As I reflect on my time at Byron House, I am left with a sense of profound loss, a loss of innocence, of peace, of the ability to see the world as it once was. I am a stranger in my own life, a wanderer lost in the shadows, forever haunted by the knowledge that there is something beyond, something dark and unknowable, waiting in the spaces between reality and nightmare. I had thought that knowledge would bring me clarity, but instead it had taken everything from me, leaving me adrift in a world that I no longer recognized. And so I offer this warning to anyone who would listen, to those who, like me, are drawn to the mysteries of the unknown, to the allure of forbidden knowledge. Beware of the darkness, for it is not a place of answers, but a void that consumes all who dare to enter. Curiosity is a powerful force, but it is also a dangerous one, a force that can lead us into realms where light cannot reach. Some doors, once opened, can never be closed. Some truths, once learned, can never be forgotten. In the end, I am left with only one truth, a final, haunting realization that echoes in my mind as I move through the shadows of my life. The darkness does not simply exist outside of us. It lies within, waiting, a hidden part of the human soul that hungers for knowledge, for power, for secrets that should remain hidden. And when we seek it out, when we open ourselves to its whispers, we risk losing ourselves, becoming part of the very darkness we sought to understand. So heed this warning and let my story serve as a testament to the cost of forbidden knowledge. For there is a darkness in this world, an ancient, malevolent force that cares nothing for our desires, our ambitions, our fragile minds. It waits, patient and unyielding, in the shadows, in the forgotten places, in the hidden corners of reality. And those who seek it out, who dare to confront it, may find themselves forever lost, their souls claimed by a truth that was never meant for human eyes. As for me, I am but a shadow of who I once was, a hollow vessel carrying the weight of truths too terrible to bear. I walk through life as though in a dream, haunted by visions of things I cannot unsee, by whispers of knowledge that gnaw at my mind, relentless and unending. I am bound to the darkness, to the secrets that lie beyond the veil, a prisoner of my own curiosity, forever marked by the shadows of Byron House.